Here's something genuinely unsettling about people with narcissistic tendencies. So many of them only wake up to what you actually meant to them once you're completely out of reach. It's almost backwards, isn't it? While you were right there, present, giving everything you had, they treated your presence like something disposable, something that would simply always be there no matter how carelessly they handled it. But the moment that presence disappears, the moment the door actually closes, something shifts inside them that they were never prepared for. And the longer that silence stretches on, the more their mind starts spinning in directions they never saw coming, directions that catch them completely off guard. Today, we're digging into what actually happens inside a narcissist's head after an extended period of no contact, not the surface level stuff, not the performance they put on for everyone watching, but the quieter, messier, internal reality that plays out once the audience is gone and there's no one left to perform for except themselves. Long-term no contact takes away something a narcissist depends on far more than most people ever realize: emotional control. This kind of control rarely announces itself loudly. It's not always shouting matches or obvious manipulation or theatrical outbursts. Sometimes it's something much quieter, like simply knowing they can text you whenever they feel like it and you'll respond. Like sensing that your emotions still orbit around them somehow. Or believing that no matter how far apart you've grown, they still take up real estate in your mind. That kind of emotional access gives them a quiet sense of power, a strange sort of stability. They can ignore you for days, treat you poorly, vanish without a word for weeks at a time, or act like they couldn't care less, and still feel completely secure, because deep down they're convinced they can waltz back in whenever they choose and stir something in you emotionally. Extended no contact shatters that assumption entirely. The moment you stop replying, stop checking on them, stop reacting to their antics, and genuinely detach on an emotional level, they lose their ability to read you. They no longer have a clue what you're feeling, whether you still care, or whether they still hold any real estate in your life at all. That not knowing becomes deeply uncomfortable for them because narcissistic personalities frequently lean on control as a way of protecting a fragile ego underneath. Your silence becomes living proof that they've lost their grip on your emotional world. And losing that grip can set off all kinds of different reactions. Some erupt in anger, others suddenly turn unusually sweet and affectionate. Some try sneakier, more indirect routes to pull your attention back. But strip away the surface behavior, and you'll usually find the same core issue sitting underneath it all. They're wrestling with the possibility that your inner world might no longer revolve around them at all. Silence has a way of planting insecurity and confusion deep inside a narcissist because it cuts off the exact information they usually rely on to feel emotionally significant. People with narcissistic traits often gauge their own importance in someone's life by the reactions they're able to provoke. It doesn't even matter whether that reaction is love, fury, sorrow, frustration, or outright desperation. Any of those still reassures them they hold sway over your emotions. As long as they can stir something in you, they feel tethered to a sense of control. But long stretches of no contact wipe out those emotional cues completely. Once you go quiet, they're left standing there with no answers. They can't tell if you still think about them, if you're healing, if you've found peace on your own, or if somebody else has quietly taken their place in your heart. That kind of not knowing becomes psychologically grating, because narcissists often struggle badly with anything they can't manage or predict. Even while acting outwardly unbothered, they may be replaying your silence over and over in their head, trying to make sense of it. The absence of access leaves behind a gap their mind keeps trying and failing to fill. And little by little, that confusion can curdle into genuine insecurity. Somebody who once felt totally confident about their hold over you might suddenly start questioning whether they ever really mattered to you in the first place. Your silence chips away at the story they've built about themselves. Plenty of narcissists genuinely believe people stay emotionally hooked on them forever, so long-term no contact directly attacks that belief at its foundation. This is why some of them eventually resurface with random messages, sudden emotional displays, manufactured concern, or subtle little attempts to reel your attention back in. Silence forces them to sit with the reality they're simply not equipped to handle emotionally. You may genuinely no longer be available for them to control. A lot of narcissists lead with fake indifference first, because guarding their image matters enormously to them. When somebody cuts them off, particularly following a relationship that ran emotionally intense, the loss usually hits them almost right away. But rather than admitting to hurt, confusion, or any real vulnerability, they bury those feelings under a mask of coldness, false confidence, or total emotional shutdown. They want the world to believe they're unaffected, because to them, admitting emotional impact feels dangerously close to weakness. That's part of why some narcissists suddenly seem happier than ever, right after no contact kicks in. They might flood social media with posts, flaunt a shiny new relationship, act overly sure of themselves, or carry on as if your absence changed absolutely nothing about their life. From the outside, it can genuinely look like they've moved on in an instant. But more often than not, that performance is less about actual peace and more about controlling how they're perceived by others and sometimes even by themselves. They want everyone, including themselves, convinced they're completely unbothered. Faking indifference also doubles as a strategy. Part of them believes that appearing unaffected might rattle you emotionally. They're hoping you'll feel rejected, envious, insecure, or tempted to come crawling back. Narcissists tend to have a sharp intuitive grasp of how emotions work, so acting emotionally frozen becomes just another way of chasing power without directly asking for attention. Real indifference, though, tends to look calm, steady, understated. Fake indifference usually feels overblown, staged, loud on the inside, even while it looks quiet on the surface. The harder someone works to convince you they don't care, the more likely it is your silence is hitting them a lot harder than they're willing to let on. Plenty of narcissists eventually come back through hoovering, guilt trips, or sudden bursts of affection because losing emotional access can feel like a genuine threat to them. Once no contact drags on and stays consistent, many of them start realizing they can no longer read your emotions, predict how you'll react, or count on you being available. That erosion of influence creates real discomfort, especially for someone who assumed you'd always remain emotionally tied to them. Instead of accepting the separation with any grace, some try desperately to drag you back into emotional contact. That's where hoovering enters the picture. Hoovering describes the pattern where a narcissist tries to worm their way back into your life after a stretch of distance or silence, usually leaning on emotional tactics designed specifically to crack open communication again. Sometimes their approach feels gentle and caring on the surface. They might apologize out of nowhere, express deep regret, claim they miss you, or show a kind of emotional vulnerability they never once displayed while you were together. Other times they lean on guilt, dredging up shared memories, painful moments, or sacrifices they insist they made for your sake. They might reach out on emotionally loaded dates, birthdays, holidays, anniversaries, because they know those particular moments tend to soften your defenses. Sudden bursts of affection are common too. Someone who is cold and distant might abruptly transform into someone intensely loving, attentive, practically overflowing with emotion. That dramatic shift can genuinely throw people off because it can feel like real, lasting change. But in many cases, that sudden warmth has far more to do with clawing back access than with building anything genuinely healthy. Once emotional control returns to them, the old familiar patterns tend to creep back in right alongside it. It helps to recognize that hoovering rarely announces itself honestly. It almost never sounds like, "I want to control you again." Instead, it sounds like concern, nostalgia, or vulnerability, because that's what actually works. A narcissist testing the waters after a long silence is often reading your reaction closely, gauging whether a soft approach or a guilt-driven approach is more likely to land. If the gentle version doesn't get a response, they might pivot towards something heavier, a message implying you've changed, that you've become cold, that you used to be kinder than this. These lines are designed to make you doubt the boundary you worked hard to build, to make your silence feel like the problem instead of their behavior. Underneath nearly all of these behaviors sits the same underlying goal: restoring their emotional influence and proving to themselves that they can still stir your emotions whenever they feel like it. A number of narcissists also monitor you indirectly, scrolling through social media or pumping mutual acquaintances for information, because even in the middle of no contact, they still crave emotional awareness and psychological access into your world. Direct conversation might stop cold, but their curiosity rarely does. Narcissistic personalities tend to struggle enormously with total loss of control, so they'll often hunt for backdoor ways to track your emotions, your healing process, your relationships, or your personal growth, all while pretending outwardly that they've moved on completely. Social media turns into one of the simplest tools for this. Some narcissists repeatedly check your profile, watch your stories on repeat, randomly like an old post from years back, or somehow appear online at exactly the same times you're active. Others create fake or anonymous accounts to quietly keep tabs on your life while maintaining the illusion that they've let go entirely. Much of this behavior comes from a need to measure whether they still have any emotional pull on you. They'll go looking for hints of sadness, loneliness, anger, or lingering attachment, because finding those things reassures them that they still occupy space inside your mind. Mutual friends and family can become unwitting sources of intel too. A narcissist might casually bring you up in conversation, mention your name out of nowhere, or try to fish for details about your current life while acting like none of it actually matters to them. Sometimes they'll play it especially subtle so they can keep up an image of total indifference in public while staying quietly plugged into your life behind the scenes. What's important to understand here is that this kind of monitoring behavior usually has far less to do with love than it does with unresolved control. They're often not missing the relationship in any emotionally healthy sense. Instead, they're struggling with the idea that your life might keep moving forward peacefully, without needing their influence, attention, or presence at all. Losing access tends to wound a narcissist's ego far more deeply than the breakup itself ever does, because for a lot of narcissistic personalities, relationships get tangled up tightly with validation, control, and their own sense of identity. The relationship was rarely experienced by them as a truly equal emotional bond in the first place. Instead, it often functioned as a steady supply of attention, admiration, reassurance, or emotional leverage. As long as they retained access to you, they felt psychologically anchored, secure in knowing they still mattered somewhere in your emotional world. Even negative, unhealthy attention was enough to satisfy that need because it confirmed their own importance. Once no contact becomes long and unwavering, that whole sense of importance starts to crumble. The narcissist stops receiving emotional reactions from you, stops getting updates about your life, stops getting any proof at all that you're still attached to them in any way. That collapse is often experienced as a genuine ego injury. Much of the pain they feel comes less from missing real intimacy and more from losing that sensation of power, relevance, and emotional leverage over another human being. It's a strange kind of grief, mourning influence rather than connection, but it's real to them nonetheless, and it can produce reactions that look a lot like heartbreak on the surface, even though the root cause underneath is something closer to wounded pride. That's exactly why some narcissists react so intensely, even after being the ones who acted distant, dismissive, or outright hurtful throughout the relationship. They can suddenly become fixated on reconnecting the moment they realize you're no longer emotionally reachable. Your silence forces them to face something their ego desperately resists: the possibility that they may no longer have the power to affect you the way they once did. For narcissistic personalities, that realization can feel deeply destabilizing, because underneath all that outward confidence often sits a remarkably fragile sense of self-worth. Losing emotional access takes away one of the mirrors they've used to validate themselves, and sometimes genuinely realizing that you're moving forward without them stings their ego far more than the actual end of the relationship ever did. Some narcissists become furious once they realize they can no longer pull the strings on your reactions, and that loss of emotional influence can feel intensely frustrating to them. Narcissistic personalities frequently depend on other people's reactions as a way of holding on to a sense of control within relationships. Whether they're stirring up affection, guilt, fear, confusion, or outright chaos, the reaction itself reassures them they're still steering the emotional atmosphere. As long as they can get you to respond, to explain yourself, to defend your position, to chase after them, or to spiral emotionally, they feel psychologically locked into a position of power. Extended no contact breaks that cycle completely. Your silence cuts off the emotional feedback loop they've grown accustomed to. Suddenly, their messages sit there unanswered. Their little attempts to provoke a reaction stop landing the way they used to. Their guilt trips, their theatrics, their attention-grabbing stunts stop producing the payoff they're used to. For a lot of narcissists, this triggers real, intense frustration because they're no longer dictating the emotional direction of things. That frustration can eventually curdle into full-blown anger. Some will fire off hostile messages, spread rumors behind your back, resort to passive-aggressive digs, or try to tarnish your reputation among people you both know. Others go cold, sarcastic, or dismissive, hoping to provoke literally any reaction out of you at all. That anger usually stems more from bruised pride than from genuine heartbreak. Your emotional detachment directly challenges their belief that they can always waltz back in and reclaim access whenever it suits them. What matters most to understand here is that your calmness becomes something foreign and uncomfortable to them. Narcissists tend to feel far more at home in emotional intensity than in emotional distance. Arguments at least keep some kind of connection alive. Silence doesn't offer them that lifeline. And once they realize they can no longer manipulate your emotions the way they once could, that loss of control can spark visible, sometimes ugly, resentment and anger. Genuine no contact reshapes your confidence, and narcissists tend to notice that shift because emotional detachment changes a person's entire energy. In the beginning, a lot of people step into no contact while still deeply hurting inside. They might still feel anxious, wounded, confused, or emotionally tangled up. But as time stretches on and the distance stays consistent, something deeper starts shifting underneath the surface. The emotional dependency gradually loosens its grip. That constant hunger for validation, explanations, or closure slowly starts to fade away. And in that space, a different kind of confidence begins to take root. It's not loud or showy. Usually it shows up as calmness, emotional steadiness, sturdier boundaries, and far less reactivity than before. You stop orbiting your life around the narcissist's moods, their attention, or their approval. You start rebuilding an identity that exists entirely outside the relationship dynamic that once swallowed so much of your emotional energy. You may notice yourself making decisions again without running them past an internal filter of how the narcissist might react, whether they'd approve or whether it would provoke some kind of scene. That freedom to simply exist without constantly managing another person's emotional temperature is something a lot of people don't realize they'd lost until they finally get it back. That inner shift becomes visible even from a distance. Narcissists are often remarkably attuned to changes in someone's emotional availability. They can sense the moment you stop reacting the way you used to, stop chasing them, stop searching for their emotional reassurance. Your growing independence quietly signals that their hold over you is fading fast. For narcissistic personalities who built so much of their identity around emotional control, that realization can feel genuinely destabilizing. This is exactly why some narcissists suddenly resurface once they sense you're truly moving forward with your life. They might grow curious, nostalgic, unexpectedly affectionate, or emotionally reactive after picking up on your growth. But here's the key thing to hold on to. Your confidence was never built on making them jealous or proving your worth to them. It came from reconnecting with your own sense of self after spending far too long trapped inside someone else's emotional control. At the end of the day, extended no contact isn't really about making a narcissist suffer. It's about breaking a cycle that kept your emotions chained to someone else's whims. That's precisely why narcissists tend to react so strongly to silence. Your silence strips away their access. It strips away their certainty. It strips away the emotional reactions they'd come to depend on to feel powerful, significant, or emotionally secure. Some respond by faking indifference. Some circle back with sudden affection, guilt, or manipulation. Some erupt in anger, spiral into obsession, or quietly watch you from the shadows. But strip away the surface, and underneath most of these reactions sits the same uncomfortable truth. They're grappling with the reality that they no longer hold any control over your emotional world. And while they're busy reacting to that loss of influence, something far more important is quietly unfolding inside you. You're healing. You're rebuilding your confidence brick by brick. You're discovering that peace feels entirely different once your emotions are no longer at the mercy of somebody else's behavior. That's the real point of no contact. It was never about revenge. It was never about seeking validation. It was never about making someone chase after you. True no contact is about reclaiming emotional freedom. It's about finally growing strong enough to stop justifying your worth to people who only valued having access to you when it served them. It's worth remembering, too, that this process rarely moves in a straight line. There will likely be days where the silence feels heavy instead of empowering, where old memories resurface and tempt you to reach out just to fill the quiet. That's normal. Healing from an emotionally exhausting dynamic isn't a clean, tidy arc, it's uneven. And some days will feel harder than others even months into the process. What matters is that you keep choosing yourself in those moments again and again, even when it feels difficult, even when part of you misses the chaos simply because it was familiar. Over time, something interesting tends to happen. The urge to check on them, to see what they're doing, to wonder if they've reached out, starts to lose its grip. Not because you stopped caring about yourself, but because your attention slowly redirects itself toward your own life, your own healing, your own future. You start noticing small things again, the things that got crowded out while you were busy managing someone else's moods and emotional unpredictability. You rediscover interests you'd shelved. You reconnect with people you drifted from while you were consumed by the relationship. You start sleeping better, thinking more clearly, feeling more like yourself again, whoever that self actually is underneath all the noise that had built up around it. And if they do come back, whether through a random text, a sudden apology, or some indirect gesture meant to test the waters, you'll likely notice that the pull isn't quite what it used to be. That's not because you've become cold or hardened. It's because you've built something steadier within yourself, something that doesn't collapse the moment they reappear with a familiar name on your screen. You get to decide calmly and without pressure whether reopening that door serves your life or simply drags you back into a pattern you already fought so hard to leave behind. In the end, none of this is really about them at all, even though it might have started that way. It becomes about you, about what you're willing to accept, about the standard you're setting for how you deserve to be treated moving forward. And sometimes the most powerful move you can make is simply continuing to walk forward, quietly and steadily, without ever needing them to fully grasp exactly what they lost.